So this is always a highlight in the GSF agenda, where we bring the largest actors on the government stage together to talk about various current affairs issues, as well as to speak to them about the theme of the conference, which this year, as you know, we're asking the question, who is changing the world? The reason we ask this is because we want to learn how change happens nowadays. We want to understand how that change and the lessons that we learn from there can be brought into schools to transform them. And amongst us, we have some prolific people. And I want to start with introducing President Bio of Sierra Leone. Please put your hands together for him. We also have my friend Ole Dibawada from the African Development Bank. We have amongst us President Santos, Nobel laureate and former president of Colombia. And we also have amongst us Mr. Blair. I'm going to start the proceedings by obviously picking on the biggest issue of our times, in my opinion. And I'm delighted that Mr. Blair has made his way over to the UAE. So, Mr. Blair, how does change happen?
Okay, so I was about to say it's an absolute pleasure to be talking about something other than the B word. Change happens when leaders set out a vision and have the executive capability of seeing it through, when change comes from below, when people agitate for change. And the best hope of getting change is when the leadership and the people are marching in step together. So, the hardest thing about politics and about being in government is making change. And in a fast-changing world, you have to change. We've all got experience of trying to make changes. The world around you is changing and you don't change, you get left behind. So making change is tough because what I found when I was in government is that if you say to people, we've got to change, everyone nods. Yeah, we do. Then when you start describing particular changes, then you get disagreement. But what I learned in government is particularly when you're talking about things like education reform, the rhythm of change is when you first propose change, people oppose it. When you're doing it, it's hell. And after you've done it, you wish you'd done more of it. Yeah, and that's basically what I learned. And right now, the single biggest challenge for any government in the world long term, apart from all the obvious issues around, climate, the economy, and so on, the biggest change is how do you educate not an elite of people well, but the broad mass of the population. And that is the biggest challenge, whether you're a low-income country, a medium-income country, or a highly developed country. It's the single biggest challenge, and it's the toughest one to meet.
Thank you so much for that. When a leader can't carry their team or carry a country, what should happen?
Okay, I see where you're heading on this. But I'm going to kind of head you off because, that's a bit of a problem, let's say. Look, sometimes, by the way, you will be in a situation where you're taking tough decisions and, there's always opposition to you. Okay, so I always say to people, when you decide, you divide. And one of the things that always, I can say this now, I'm not running for office anymore. One of the things I used to find irritating was when people would say, you got to listen to the people. And I would say, yeah, I'm listening. But you know what? They're saying different things. So, in the end, a leader's got to decide. But ultimately, if you can't take your own core team around you, it becomes very, very difficult to do the job. Without getting into too much detail about our present situation, we're in a moment of real crisis. And obviously, if the leader's finding it hard to get the support of those directly around the leader, then it becomes, very challenging, very difficult, if not impossible.
There's a Conservative peer and a friend of ours, Lord Gadia, in the room somewhere. And the Daily Express yesterday quoted him by saying that Theresa May has no more than next week to remain as Prime Minister. Do you agree with that statement?
you know, I'm sorry. I've done the job of being Prime Minister, okay, and I know how difficult it is. And frankly, she doesn't need me making it any more difficult in this particular moment in time. And in any event, frankly, what I say is completely irrelevant. This will be a decision that the cabinet, I think, really will take, and it depends. It depends if they've lost confidence in her. Obviously, this is going to be a huge problem for her. But you know, one thing I will say, because I don't think it's appropriate for me to start saying what should happen to the Prime Minister at this moment in time. The one thing I do say to everyone, though, is that my country is going through a really difficult period, that's for sure. But don't write us off, okay? It's been a big mess. We're in a lot of trouble. It is a moment of national crisis. But I absolutely promise you, one way or another, I obviously have very strong views about Brexit, but whatever happens on Brexit, one way or another, Britain will get back on its feet again. We'll be a serious country again. We will sort ourselves out, and we will make sure we do the right thing for our people.
President Santos, you brought a war to an end. You were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize as a result of it. You know, how do you...
And I lost the referendum.
And, we want to go back to this. No. So, how do you make progress with people that you fundamentally disagree with? You can't stand having an argument with them even. What are the tools that you deployed in bridging that gap?
Well, first of all, when you were asking what happens if the people are not with you, there are moments where if you are correct, if you know that what you're doing is the correct way, then you have to go against the will of the people for some time, because they will eventually support you, maybe...
Or bend you.
Maybe not in the short run, but maybe in the long run. But I had a lesson when I was very young, when I went into the Navy, and the officer said, go and learn how to sail. It was a small sailboat, and I went with the sailboat, and I had no idea what to do. And he started laughing. I said, first lesson, very important in your life and in everything that has to do with government and with enterprise, you have to know where to go. And once you decide where to go, then no matter if the winds are against you or with you, you will eventually achieve your goal, your purpose. And something else that I think is very important for change, and I learned this from the British Prime Minister Blair when I went and asked him for help. I was in the middle of the war. I wanted to weaken my adversaries in order to bring them to the table, and I needed intelligence. And he sent me to MI6, Sir John Scarlett, who gave me a lesson in intelligence, but he said something very important. To do good intelligence and to be a good, effective leader, you need many times to think out of the box, think differently. Those two lessons, I think, are very important to achieve change, to achieve success in government, and to go out of problems when they appear, that they always appear.
So we seem to be in a box when it comes to the political and economic crisis related to Venezuela. You know, there's a standoff at the border with Colombia, and there's a regional refugee crisis. Do you think you would have handled the response to any crisis any different to how it is being handled today?
Well, no, I think what they're doing is okay. I would have done differently two things. First, I would not allow the U.S. to be in the front line. It's better to be in the second row. And to allow the U.S. to be in the front line, that is counterproductive because of the historic relations between Latin America and the U.S. And secondly, we need to give the regime a way out, what they call build the golden bridge. Show him a dignified way out, because the number one priority for a Colombian who will be, who we already are in a very difficult position because we have 2,200 kilometers of live border with Venezuela, more than 1.3 million refugees are already in Colombia, but to avoid violence. Violence will bring not 1.3 million, would be 4 or 5 million. And violence in Venezuela will perpetuate because they have no institutions right now. And so we have to avoid violence, and the only way to avoid violence is to negotiate a golden bridge. And there you need the major stakeholders that have something to do. Who are they? China, Russia, Cuba, the US, and Latin America. If there is the will, I would say that it's easy to negotiate a golden bridge, but you have to have the will.
President Bio, you were a military leader. You shed your uniform to fight elections. You even lost once, but then you came back and you won your national elections. What is the one leadership lesson that you have learned in this process?
Well, when you decide to go for elections, or when you decide to be a national leader, you must have the purpose. And it's not just about leadership. You want to be a president or head of state. It's about the vision you have for your country and knowing full well that you have the wherewithal within to be able to deliver your nation. When I was in the military, I tried to bring peace. We had an 11-year civil war. Like my friend, he came to our help. He's always been there to help. He didn't give me intelligence lessons, definitely. He actually sent troops to help us finish the war. But because of the lessons I learned during that time, I knew that I had the will and the power within me to be able to change Sierra Leone. So even when I left, in the interim period, all I did was to prepare for the leadership of that country, because I knew that we have a lot of potentials, but we've been lacking in leadership at the national level. And to be able to bring peace or initiate a process that led to peace, I knew I could do better things. So I was focused on coming back and changing my country, Sierra Leone. So that goal kept me going and wanting to be there, because I knew I had to be in the driving seat to be able to effect such a big change.
2 days ago, we had a conversation where you repeatedly brought up the words human capital. Now, you've dedicated a vast amount of your national budget towards education in particular. Do you want to speak about where that drive comes from? Because we don't see it replicated in other countries across Africa. Why is it that you've settled on that?
I have a couple of reasons why I insist that the flagship program of my country is human capital development. And when I talk about human capital development, I'm talking about three things. One is education, two, food security, and three, health security. I am a testament to that fact, because I grew up from a village. I lost my dad when I was only 4 years old. My mom was not fortunate to go to school. But she insisted that I go to school. I went to school with her support and other family networks that helped me to go through education. It was a long and difficult journey from a village to where I am today, I think it's been an extremely difficult journey, but I think I've succeeded because of education. And to be in a country where 3 out of 5 adults cannot read and write, and to have seen the enormous benefit of education to myself, this is something I want to share with everybody in the world, that education will lay a solid foundation.
President Beer, I want to come to my friend over here, Ms. Dibawada from the African Development Bank. I'm going to ask her a question for the first time ever she's being asked. She probably doesn't want this asked. Ole, the speculation that you're considering running for president of your country.
I was wondering why I'm sitting here, because I thought I don't fit in this match. And you have to be careful about the rumors, Vickers. You have to be very careful. Well, this is the first time I'm hearing about that in public. Mm-hmm. So, you know.
What advice would you give a very dynamic leader like Ole, President Beer, on how she brings change in the Gambia?
In the Gambia?
That's where she's from.
I'm sandwiched, definitely. My wife is a Gambian, partially. And now I am sitting here with somebody who may want to aspire to the leadership of that country. But for any person who wants to aspire to leadership, you should really search your conscience. Do you have what it takes to be a leader? Because it's an extremely difficult phenomenon, leadership. It's extremely difficult to get there when you think about electioneering, but it is even more difficult when you get there. Do you have the wherewithal in terms of resources, in terms of your psychology as a person? Do you have the network? Do you have the political will in the population? Do you have the will to change the minds of people to support you? When all of that is done, then you now, how do you lead a nation? Because the essence of getting there is to bring about change, change that will impact positively on the lives of your people. If you can do that and you are sure, I will tell you the best thing is to start to plan how to deliver when you get there. Because as soon as you get there, you are going to be bombarded by different things. And like my colleagues have said, you may even forget your focus, your goal for which you were actually elected. Because ethnic considerations are going to come in. Your cronies are going to be around you. Regional considerations are going to come in. So in your personal capacity, most times when you want to take a decision, few factors actually come into play. But at the national level, the calculus becomes extremely difficult because the factors that come into that are extremely many, and you must take bits of them to be able to make a decision that will be accepted, and that which can actually take you or keep you on your focus.
Mr. Blair, your institute does a lot of work in Africa. And forgive me, I'm not sure if I know whether you work in Gambia, but the question I ask is, has Africa's time arrived when the likes of Ole Dibawada considered becoming president of our country?
Yeah, what's it like to be spoken about like this?
I'm wondering what's going on.
Yeah. You're going to be sort of nominated by the room in a minute, yeah. So, look, the single most important thing about governing is that it's just a world away from campaigning. Okay, and the thing you realize when you're campaigning for office, you know, someone once said, you know, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And, you know, when you're campaigning, it's all talk, 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 and you're promising and blah, 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 you know. And frankly, that's the easy bit of politics. The hard bit is when you sit in the decision-making seat, and then you suddenly find that there are a whole lot of things that need to be fixed. It's very difficult to fix them. There are all sorts of interests that block you. And what I learned is really the following. Number one, as the President Biya has just been saying, you've got to keep your focus. Because what happens when you're in government is events. Things happen. Your cabinet will be misbehaving. There'll be a scandal here and a problem there and a crisis will erupt from nowhere, right? You'll be dealing with these things, but you've got to keep your focus, because in the end, what changes your country is embedding real long-term change. President Santos did an amazing job in Colombia, keeping his focus on the peace process when all around them there were masses of problems happening. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, whenever I read from anyone, one of these Vision 2030s, Vision 2050s, and so on, which have you, I always say to them, it's great, these things. You read them, and in an ideal world, this would be exactly what would happen. But here's the problem. You don't live in an ideal world. You live in the real world. So prioritization, I reckon in one term, if you're lucky, 3 or 4 things will you can really move the needle. It's not to say you don't do everything else, but really focus on it. Third, you've got to get the policy right. Policies are difficult. Politics at a certain level is a much more intellectual business than people think. I mean, okay, not at the level of the campaign, but at the level of government, you've got to have the right policy. So if you're talking about education, it's not enough just to be committed to education. What are the policies that are going to actually move the needle on education? And then the final thing is personnel. One of the things you learn about politics, and it's, by the way, no different from anything else. The only thing that's different about politics is the only profession in the world where you can reach the top with 0 qualifications. I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's the weirdest thing. I mean, if you were running a football team, you wouldn't just go to the stand of supporters and say, hey, who really wants this job? Oh, yeah, I can do it. You never, if you were owning a football team, you would never choose your coach like that. But anyway, this is politics, which is fine. But you've got to choose the right people around you, because what you realize is that having that good team of people who, by the way, are prepared to challenge you as well as say yes to you, who are, committed and loyal, but not sort of stupidly so. Building that team around you is also important. So, purpose, prioritization, policy, personnel.
Thank you so much for that. Well, I do come to you finally. You are the Director of Human Capital, Youth and Skills at the African Development Bank. There's been lots of talk about, Africa rising for a long time. Do you see that ever happening?
I think Africa is rising. Yeah. There is a lot of changes that have happened. We see President Biya coming in and making, strategic changes. There are quite a number of, Africa is in one country, and we need to realize that. There are 54 countries, very diverse, very different. If you want to measure Francophone West Africa, it's different from Francophone Central Africa. So it's so different. So you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to looking at Africa as a whole. So I think we need to get that first straight. But personally and professionally, I think there's been a lot of fundamental positive changes that are happening. We've got a lot of vibrant leaders that are coming in, which is different from what we used to have. It's happening, it's slow, but change is happening. So Africa is rising.
Where do we stand with corruption today on the subcontinent?
It depends on how do you describe corruption? What exactly do you mean by corruption? It can be interpreted differently by different people. Corruption in terms of telling stories or making promises you can't keep. Corruption by taking funds that doesn't belong to you. It depends on how you interpret corruption. I think not just in Africa, globally, there is corruption everywhere. So in Africa in itself, we've come a long way. It's been 52, 53 years now since independence for some countries. And it's been slow in some. We've had coups. That is no longer, that's a history now in African countries. I think a lot, as Mr. Blair said, sometimes it's when you get in there, it's learning by doing. You go in there, you realize, and you grow into it. So nobody goes in and says, I know I have the answer, and it's not a box. It's not a one size fits all. So I'm not sure whether I've answered your question.
Thank you, Ole. I'm going to take some questions from the floor, and I'm going to go first to the lady in red over there who has signaled that she wants to ask a question. And then I will also go somewhere back here because I don't get the chance to see. Anyone want to ask a question over here? No questions. This is incredible. At the very back over there. And the lady whose hair I envy. Over there. We'll stick over here. If you go to the lady in red first, please.
Hi, this is a question for Mr. Blair. You mentioned partly what you say with regards to the UK political state is irrelevant because you're not part of the system or in politics any longer. Are you grateful for the separation at the minute, or is there something you want to be involved in?
You know, the honest answer to this is that when things are really bad, it's actually when you want to be there, which people always find odd. You know, I have a lot of people say to me, God, you must be really glad you're not in it anymore. And I think, no, not really. But, you know, obviously I've been doing a lot on the Brexit issue, and it's one of the things that you realize, it's an odd thing about politics. Because also, I will say the journey of politics is that you start at your least capable and most popular, and you end at your least popular and most capable. And partly what happens is over time, you actually do, you know, you learn a lot from the process of being in government. And one of the things that I think is really important, and by the way, I think Africa's definitely is on the rise. I don't think there's any doubt about that in my view, in many, many ways. But one of the reasons is that I think you are getting presidents who are coming into office today, like President Bio is an example of this, but I think there are many more examples, you know, where they actually are coming in for the purpose of changing their country. And I think, you know, the one thing I kind of learned about politics through the process of being in government is that in the end, you know, all of these things kind of confuse and collide with you when you're in government. But after you look back, you know, what matters is how much change are you really able to make in your country? And, you know, did you bed it down? And that's why sometimes I think that, you know, even after you leave, and you were asking me about, you know, you're anxious to be separated from it now, even after you leave, and this is what I do with my institute now, it's quite important to use what you've learnt in government to try and inform the debate and the policy about what happens when you are in government today. So, for example, the subject here is who is changing the world. I mean, I think, you know, one of the interesting things is what is changing the world. We're going to have a conversation in the course of the next couple of days all around ed tech and technology. I mean, these changes that are going to happen around technology are going to be vast. Now, how every single country handles this, the opportunities and the problems, is going to be a major part of the political debate. And so what I would say is, you know, sometimes what is important in politics is, even if you're not still in the front line and running for office, you know, to be part of the debate, because believe it or not, it's like anything else in life. If you've done it for a considerable period of time, you actually do have lessons, you have experiences that you've been through. And right now, the changes that are happening are so fundamental and so difficult, it really is important to use every bit of experience and, you know, all the different things that you've done to try and help make sense of the situation. And, you know, this is why, frankly, on the Brexit thing, even though I'm not in the front line anymore, I believe so passionately it's a mistake for my country that I felt absolutely determined to be part of the debate.
If you so I just want to pursue a particular question. If you were a betting man, do you think we will exit on 29th of March?
On 29th of March, no.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one follow-up, please? Do you
Yes.
think Mrs. May is now at her least popular, not most capable?
That's very smart. You should be an interviewer. Yeah. No, I'm not sure about that one, really.
We'll move on. If you go to that lady, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sylvia. I'm from Brazil. My question is to Mr. Olay, the next president of Gambia. So, I would actually, you are a black woman from Africa into this international decision-making platform. You are among leaders of the world, and most of them are white and, let's say, a bit getting older, right?
Thank you.
So I would like to know, it's really important, I would like to know, how do you feel by being in this place? And what do you do to bring more women with you, to empower them to take a deep role in politics?
Okay. Well, I mean, for someone who's not a politician, I'll
Yes.
try my best to answer the question. I think over the years, I have been engaging and working with politicians. I've worked in organizations that have been engaged in getting women in political leadership. I was the executive director for Farm Africa Solidarity, and we were promoting women in political leadership, women in entrepreneurial leadership. But mostly we were actually trying to identify young African women that we would groom and mentor to go into leadership, because a lot of African women don't want to go into politics. It comes with its own excess baggage. There's stigma, there is cultural issues, religious issues. Sometimes the question is, Africa probably needs women to come in. It's been a long time, but is Africa ready for women to come in? I mean, for me, that's the question. We've had 3 women. We've had Catherine Samba-Panza, that was interim. We've had Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. We've had Joyce Banda, who's just pulled out. We need to have more women, and we need to have more role models that would encourage more young women to go in. But it's still a boys' club. The architecture is still a boys' club.
President Bio is
And maybe we should invite the current presidents that are now more liberal and more open to encourage young African girls and perhaps create an academy of political leadership. We have the African Leadership Academy in South Africa, but have one where we can now start grooming young Africans to aspire and look at role models that could go and speak to them and teach them.
Wonderful. The gentleman at the back over there.
Thank you very much. My question is a follow-up question to the question by my colleague here. And it's also about the leadership question. The average median age of African leaders is about 60, 65. The average median age of Africans generally is below 20. How do we systematically raise a new generation of leaders? And also directly to President Bio on the question of encouraging women. I'm also challenging you that you can achieve 50-50 representation in your cabinet, and that's one direct way to ensure that women rise up to the leadership position. Thank you.
You want to respond to that?
Yes, so definitely I want to respond to that. She alluded to the fact that there are cultural issues. I will maybe let you know that in forming my cabinet, there are a few women that I actually contacted who turned down my request. And that is because of what she actually said. The audacity to be there and going through the rigors, it's quite challenging in Africa. And sometimes people are just afraid to get there. The scrutiny you get at the leadership level in Africa is quite tough. And most women are not prepared mentally for that. So in terms of leadership qualities, I think we have a lot of women on the continent who can actually perform this role. What we don't have at the moment is an environment, the people, to accept. Because the thing against women is actually women themselves.
I agree with you, Mr. President.
The first time I contested, my running mate was a lady, capable. A lady, a woman of substance. They brought all sorts of excuses. And women, if only women had supported them, I was going to win the first time I contested. Because 51% of the population in Sierra Leone are women. So there is a lot to be done, actually. It's not just about helping them. It's not just about leadership. I think we have qualified in terms of really taking up the leadership role in Africa. But we still have to do a lot of awareness raising among our population for them to know that, yes, women also can lead.
President Santos, I have asked Mr. Blair, President Bio, and Ms. Dibawada previously, and I want to end on this note, but I ask you, in terms of, tonight we have the ceremony for the Global Teacher Prize. We have previously had Colombian teachers in our finals, and I remember the famous story of a mutual friend who told me that on finding out that one of your teachers was in the top 10, I think it was around midnight your time, you ran to the phone and actually called him to congratulate him. Tell me about your favorite teacher.
My favorite teacher?
Yeah.
Well, I had quite a few good teachers during my school years. I very well remember the teacher who taught me how to write. This was something that for me was extremely important. The way he taught me how to write, the value of words and the precision of the words, that was something that stuck with me all my life. My mathematical teacher in mathematics, how he explained to me that mathematics was like playing football in the sense of training your body, but this is training your mind, and how the mathematics will help me solve problems in the future, any kind of problems. I just have a tremendous remembrance of my teachers, and I will tell you an anecdote. Just last semester, I went to a classroom in Harvard where I have a fellowship, and the students asked me, one of the students said, Mr. Santos, how should we address you? Mr. President or Nobel Peace Laureate? And I said, do you really want to honor me? You can address me as somebody who I have all my life wanted to be, Professor Santos. And I think that's why I called this person, because I remember, and I want to emphasize the presence here of two persons that I think in today's world are becoming more and more relevant. When Tony Blair launched his third way and his program, that my program is education, education, and education. And that is extremely important. For example, you were asking corruption. The best antidote for corruption in any country is education. Sure. When you have an educated society, they protect themselves from corrupt people. But in today's world, where we're so confused with populism, nationalism, and ideologies, I truly believe that the approach to government that Tony Blair, and I see the presence here of Matteo Renzi from Italy, the third way, the third way in today's polarized world is something that we have to rescue. And maybe with some changes in the conditions of today's world, but an approach like that to bring the polarized world again to the center is something that is badly needed. And when I heard this morning Steven Pinker and the progress, I thought to myself, you go to the countries that had tremendous progress in all the indicators that he mentioned, and the third way was when all these countries progressed the most.
Sir, forgive me, I was going to end on the last question, but I need to ask one more.
Sure.
You know, you talk about the third way, but isn't the rise of this radical right, you know, a response to this so-called spineless third way?
No, I think that this radical right is a response to the lack of a correct third way. When you don't have the way to satisfy the people in their expectations, that's when these radical ideologies start to flourish. You're seeing it, for example, in my part of the world, populism on the left, populism on the right. Why have they emerged in that way? Because of the lack of the capacity to fulfill the expectations of the people. And that's why I say that the third way, a practical approach, you allow the markets to work until it's possible and the state intervenes when it's necessary. That approach is the best approach that I have seen in the recent history in terms of trying to satisfy the needs of the people. And we need to rescue that and try to rescue what that means in order precisely to counteract these polarizations of the extreme right or the populist left.
Mr. Blair, I'm sorry I have to end on... I have to ask you. I'd be crucified afterwards. Do you have a response to that?
Well, I agree, surprisingly enough. No, look, the central thing that is driving the populism at the moment is the world is changing very fast, and people feel, at least this is in the West, people feel they've lost control. Okay, and they feel that their world has been changed without their consent, and you know this is why these issues around immigration, for example, become big questions and drive a lot of the populism on the right. And then, you know, you see the power of corporate capital grow, and this drives a lot of the populism on the left. But in the end, you know, it's like, and you can see this with the Brexit thing. I mean, quite apart from all the problems with Brexit itself, probably the most disturbing impact is not the destructive effect, but the distractive effect. I mean, literally, you're not dealing with the big questions of the country. And so this is where we come back to this question of education, because in the end, this is the single biggest thing that is going to determine whether countries succeed or not. The world is getting more and more interconnected, and that's going to carry on happening. So what do young people need? They need to be able to think and operate in that connected world. And by the way, the best answer to bringing more women into politics and into business and everything else is education also. Because if young girls get educated properly, you know, they don't sit there thinking their only future is to be a child production mechanism. They actually realize that they can get out and do things in the world and be as successful as men. So, you know, everything comes back to this central question of how you manage to create the right mechanisms and right system of government in order to educate the broad mass of people. Because in the end, this world will divide into two. Those who are capable of operating in an interconnected, interdependent world and who've been taught to think creatively, and those who frankly aren't going to be qualified, and they're going to be the ones left behind. So this is why this is the absolutely vital thing. So my point is, yes, you should deal with the abuses of business, and yes, you should make sure there are proper controls over immigration, but in the end, the trouble with this populism is that it rides the anger, but it doesn't provide the answers. And the central thing, if you want to provide the answers, is deal with these problems, but recognize the single most important thing that will determine your future as a country is whether you can educate your people to the highest extent of their potential.
On that note, President Santos, President Biro, Oladibawada, Tony Blair, thank you so much for your time. Friends, please stay seated. Let our guests leave first.